Greetings, friends and wargamers. I go by Panic Check, and I hope for this to be the first of many commented battle reports I have to share with you. I've been following Dropfleet since its launch under Hawk Wargames, and I have truly enjoyed both the universe and the gameplay. However, it has always suffered from the disadvantage of all miniature wargames in that it doesn't make for an amazing spectator experience. Much of the game involves planning, measuring, chatting, maybe taking back that move you just realized was illegal, which is fun for the players but very hard to follow. Similarly, it's hard to record the map and movements in good detail, making the best attempts at recording long and losing a lot of the important details, granularity of the game. So my hope is that by providing these high detail, high resolution reports, I can provide a viewing experience similar to what RTS gamers enjoy, providing a way for people to better learn, discuss tactics, or just have an enjoyable lunch break. So I plan to always release these battle reports in pairs. Many of you have already seen the streamlined version of this battle report already. Those versions are quick, they contain almost all the details necessary to follow the match, for those who want a general overview or just not interested in hearing me ramble. But in these commented versions, I hope to take some time and chat to add a few additional things. One, I want to add some details. Much of the game of Dropfleet involves minor details the camera just can't show. Can that ship see around the debris field? What is in range? What is an arc? Until virtual reality is advanced enough, no viewer can really appreciate that, and I hope to provide some context for what limits the activated ships are struggling with. Two, I want to discuss why some of the choices are being made, as well as some potentially better options that were available if we were playing optimally. And three, I want to use these as examples to discuss some of the tactics for people that are trying to up their game. Now, depending on what the community thinks of my tangents, there may be options to mix up this formula. Maybe I should just focus on one and leave 2 and 3 for other dedicated tactics videos. I don't know, this is all a very new experiment and we'll see how it goes. For now, I will let the intro do its thing. If you wish to jump to where the commentary restarts, you can click the Fleets discussion chapter in the description below to jump to that overview. Otherwise, I will catch you afterward. Okay, and we're back. So let's talk about these fleets, starting with this overall fleet numbers comparison. Now, for the 5 of you who want to know the nitty-gritty of how these numbers were derived, good news, kindred spirits. A video discussing exactly where they come from, how I use them to judge ships, is almost out, along with enough Excel spreadsheets to make an EVE Online player happy. For those who perhaps have nightmares about algebra and are just willing to take my word for it, effective hull is the number of 3+ shots that the orbital battle line, that is, the ships not in atmosphere or on the edge of the map, could expect to take. Effective damage is the amount of damage to a 3+ armored target that same line could expect to deal under ideal conditions, as in they get their weapons free, there's no PD or maneuvering, etc. Relative range is mostly equal to move plus your scan minus sig, meaning that the ship with the greater relative range will be in firing distance first. Launch and drop are relatively self-explanatory. So overall, the TTA have more durability, but somewhat less range and damage than the Blue CM. Because these numbers do not include the Triumvir bonus and probably underestimate the effectiveness of ablative armor, the durability advantage for the TTA is a bit larger than this appears. And similarly, because it overestimates the power of bombers, the difference in damage is also slightly larger. However, as a whole, both fleets are relatively balanced forces themselves and comparable in capabilities across fleets. So I'm going to take a moment now to discuss how these fleets were constructed, because I think it's a good exercise. My approach is to break down any battle plan into 3 key pillars. 1, you've got your strategy, your big picture plan to win. For example, a strategy I've used well in the past is to say that I will focus a large, powerful force on controlling these limited objectives, enough to win, while having a small covert group to contest the other ones and pressure my opponent, hopefully tying up their resources defending them. Then you have tactics, the individual moves or maneuvers you're planning to use. For example, a Scourge player may have a small 4-Degen strike group which plans to max thrust across the board on a last activation followed by a first activation, giving him a very powerful first strike that's difficult to interrupt. And finally, you have your build, the composition of your fleet list. Now, when developing a battle plan, you can start at any point. Perhaps you start with a grand strategy and ask, well, how do I implement that? Or starting with a particular ship or build you want to try and then go backwards to say, well, what strategy does this enable? What tactics can I use? But you've got to consider all these aspects in your overall plan. So let's talk about how this UCM force was designed. I first started with my assets. I knew that I was facing resistance, if not on what map. So I know that I have the advantage in atmospheric fighting because I have better range in my corvettes and my Kievs to provide additional atmospheric support. I also have an advantage in range. So I was thinking, well, maybe my overall strategy will be to own the atmosphere. I'm going to push up with strike carriers, having corvettes and Kiev on overwatch that make sure I own it, and then the pressure is on my opponent, who is slow and short-ranged, to march up with bulk landers into the range of my better orbital guns. So that was the plan. So given that we have that strategy, what sort of things do we need from our build? Well, to start with, what specific things does this strategy absolutely require? I said I wanted to control atmosphere, so that means lots of strike carriers. That means corvettes and Kiev squad. Now for the Santiago, I wanted to get a 4-ship group that would be small enough to really force my opponent to commit their corvettes or strike carriers first and allow me to control the activation order. And that's where the Juno battle group of 4 Santiagos come from. Then I also wanted to fit another 2 Santiagos somewhere else, because what if they send strike carriers to multiple clusters, or they often have Senecas which hide in atmosphere? I want to be able to have a small force that can be sent after a single or a small group of atmospheric assets. So they're going to be fit in somewhere else. For the Kievs, I find that a hit squad of 3 is very effective. If you pair them with Limas, then you have everything you need to attack a target at extreme range, and they still have a pretty low SR at 8, meaning they're going to go before most of the units that could threaten them. And they have an exceptional DPS against orbital targets, but they're also going to give us the option to flex into shooting atmospheric targets if needed. So that's where the sword battle group came from. Because this strategy ended up needing so many light ships, I was only able to sneak in 6 strike carriers, though I honestly would have preferred more. So now that we have the ships that we know are necessary for this strategy, let's try to fill out the rest of the list. So the next box we're going to need to check off here is drop. As a general rule for me, I'd say that about a third of the list should be spent on ships dedicated to the ground game. If anything, this usually leaves me light on drop. It's not a hard rule, but it's a starting point. If I'm deviating toward more or less, I need to consider that as part of my strategy. Here, we already have about 300 points of strike carriers and corvettes, so I added a San Fran that helped fill out the drop and also fit with the battle group puzzle, as it let us get those additional strike carriers without using a Pathfinder group. Next, we have to consider launch. In general, carriers offer some of the highest potential damage in the game, but it comes with the downside that it can be blocked by maneuvers or point defense. While you don't necessarily have to take any launch, ignoring it means leaving yourself open to potentially tremendous damage from a launch-heavy opponent. And also, if you are going to be investing in launch because you want to go on the offensive, you should know that the more you invest in, the more effective it becomes as you start to overwhelm your enemy's defenses. So the question you have to ask yourself is, how much do you want to invest in the launch game? Is it enough to overwhelm enemy point defense? Just enough to contest their bombers? Just run without any? In this case, I know that the Resistance has access to very cheap and very effective fighter coverage that I'm not likely to break through until late game. But on the flip side, their bombers are relatively weak. Therefore, I chose to go with a modest launch investment that would just be enough to spoil potentially wimpy bomber attacks, but are unlikely to do damage. There's a lot of options in the UCM for doing this. Here I chose to go with a Johannesburg and Seattle because that should provide a modest 6 fighters for the combat air patrol while bringing very good hull and guns to the more decisive direct fire battle. Next, we have to consider where to put our admiral. Now, in general, you get a discount for placing your admiral in heavier ships, which can make otherwise questionable picks a really good idea, because if you knock 20 to 40 points off most ships, they start looking a lot better. In this case, the Johannesburg makes a good flagship for smaller games because you're going to want 1, that single heavy ship to benefit from the discount. 2, you're going to want a ship that can keep your admiral alive, so one that can abuse cover. Let's now have a moment of silence for all those admirals who've been based on Perths who must point straight at their enemy. And 3, you're always going to want some launch defense for your fleet, so Johannesburg, while not exceptional in any one aspect, checks a lot of the boxes your fleet's going to require anyway, so makes it a good solid all-rounder, and I find for low point games, it's an exceptional place to put your admiral. Now finally, after checking all our other boxes and filling out our various fleet and build taxes, we have about 200 points left over to do whatever we want with. And at this point, we've got all the fast and finesse bits I felt the fleet needed, so at this point we just need large amounts of hull and guns. And to that end, a pair of Rios fits really well here. With their squadron benefit, they do really good flexible damage, they're very durable. Since they're not going to be in the first wave, they're likely to keep that squadron bonus working for a long time, so they're just a good way to bring more numbers into a fist fight. So we're going to fill out this with the last 2 being a couple Rios. After we have all our idea of all the ships we want though, we have to play the puzzle game of fitting all these choices into good battle groups. And there's a number of things to consider here. Are my groups such that I can play reasonably different types of approach, be that deployment, column, or distant, or am I potentially leaving myself at risk of having key battle groups not show up until late in the game? For example, the most common thing is if you're playing a distant deployment and you've got a super heavy, like a battleship or a dreadnought, then maybe your admiral doesn't show up till turn 3. And if that's a New York that's got all your fighter coverage, that can be a real problem. So you've got to consider, have you made your groups such that everything that you need is going to be able to get on the table in a timely fashion? Another thing you have to consider is, do the ships that I have grouped together need conflicting types of special orders? Some ships like a Seattle, they're laid back, they don't care, they don't need any particular special order, they're just willing to do whatever the fleet needs, and therefore pairing them with something else that may have a very specific set, like for example, a Berlin really wants to weapons free, or course change to keep its front narrow arc on, putting those 2 together is okay, but if you're putting 2 that both need very specific sets of special orders that are different, you may be limiting it where some of your ships can't get the orders they need. so make sure your ships feel like they should have compatible orders. And another question you're going to have to ask is, what is their strategy rating? There are certain ships that are really going to need that last first activation. We talked about for the Kievs, it's a very advantageous ability for them. So for those ones that really need to activate on time, you need to pay attention to keeping them in a low SR group. So in this case, we successfully got all the groups under 15 in case we got distant deployment. But otherwise, I was running out of time and just sort of put the ships wherever, and you can tell these battle groups aren't quite optimized. But in general, that's how this UCM list came to be and how I generally approach the problem when coming to a new scenario. So now that we've discussed the general pattern for how I do this, we can a bit more quickly go through the Remnant. Two big advantages the Remnant have is their ability to be exceptionally durable when necessary, and also their ability to customize their ships to whatever role they're required. The overall strategy per mini-boss was to have a durable core of drop escorted by a triumvir that's advancing and soaking up fire, while at the same time a more high damage, fragile attack group is pushing up the middle and flank. So what are the necessary ships for this? Well, the triumvir is the thing that's going to try to provide that extra durability. Beyond that, there's not many ships that are directly necessary, but we'll have to keep that strategy in mind as we're moving through the different steps. When it comes to drop, the resistance are somewhat limited in that their strike carriers do not have outlier or open, so they have to be with whatever groups they're brought with. They can't really spread out very easily, so he elected to only go with one group of 3 strike carriers, and also 2 Aldrin in order to get some tanky, good amount of drop. And finally, a group of corvettes as the only anti-atmosphere option for the resistance. Now overall, this is pretty light. It's only about 350 points worth of drop, but per his report, it was just hard fitting all the other things the resistance needed. So he's admittedly slightly light on drop, but that gives him at least bulklander, strike cruiser, and corvette options. Next, for his launch defense, the resistance really requires launch because it doesn't have any PD baseline or Aegis. Luckily, they have many easy ways to bring highly effective fighters. In this case, he already has the Triumvir, which brings 6, and wanted at least another 6, which there's an infinite number of ways for them to get. In his case, he elected to go with 2 Seattle-esque type cruisers that had 1 launch each, as well as vent cannons and artillery cannons. Now here we should mention that one of the Resistance's advantages is the ability to drop an entire major spike when they go on standard orders, which makes them very slippery. Even if opponent has spiked you and you're in range, depending on when you activate, you might completely lose that spike and drop out of range again. So his plan being that he already has his drop and Triumvir expecting to take the damage, instead of giving these launch cruisers armor and making them more durable, give them more guns, get them up where they're going to be able to single thrust launch, fire, and contribute to the damage while relying on their slipperiness and ability to drop spikes and have other targets soaking up my attention to be their defense. And that will give him enough launch to block essentially any bomber spam the UCM could bring, as long as all his carriers remain viable. As far as the Admiral goes, there's already a Triumvir, which is a very durable, safe home for an Admiral, so that's fleshed out. And finally, that brings us to filling out the rest of the list, which has a lot of question marks here. The damage part of the force is really still what's missing. In terms of damage, the Gladiator is one of the best weapons-free options the Resistance have, especially when a Galileo is paired with it. So one of those was definitely in. And we also have those launch cruisers, which are gun cruisers with launch, which are pretty shooty and definitely not tanky. He then filled out the rest with gun cruisers that have double vent, double artillery cannon, making them have pretty dang good firepower. They don't require any sort of special orders though. They can do all their weapons on standard orders and again be protected by the slipperiness. So instead of investing in, say, mass railguns, which would do more damage on weapons free, he instead elected to go with something that's going to be pretty high damage, but wouldn't have to spike itself, and would in fact be dropping major spikes every turn. So the plan being to load up on all the guns and try not to be hit rather than try to be tanky with high armor. And finally, there's a little room for Senecas, which are pretty great little ships. They can do devastating damage if they get their fire ships off, but they have short range and don't attack till the roundup phase. However, they have atmospheric, so if they jump into the atmosphere, they can then follow that up with a last activation where they rise up and attack without giving their opponent any chance to shoot them down first. So they can really be effective if you can sneak them into a low SR group that makes them a big threat without too much of a cost. They can be a real pain to deal with. Now, after taking all those ships and playing the battle group puzzle, we end up with these battle groups. And with that, the stage is set, the combatants are ready, let's get over to the battle itself. Round 1. First flip is the Triumvir and San Fran groups. I let the Triumvir go first on the principle that unless you have a specific thing to gain by going faster, it's usually better to let your opponent go first and make them commit so then you can react to their moves and have more information. The Triumvir therefore gets the first activation. It and the Aldrin advance toward their home cluster, though they're out of range for drop this turn. The Triumvir starts placing its box of scraps, and this is one of the reasons that the mini-boss brought it on the first turn. It starts placing scraps and gaining value immediately. If you're not familiar, the box of scraps rule means that once it puts a token on a target, when that target is destroyed, it comes back with D3 hull points remaining. So the more tokens he can put out, the more health his fleet's going to have, and that's the reason he got it out so it can immediately start buffing his units. Apparently you can do this with the Galileo as well, since the tokens don't expire, so the Resistance actually have a way of stockpiling bonuses on their units if they can get them out early. Next up, the San Fran and Lysander's advance. The San Fran is similarly out of drop range, so it might as well run silent. The Lysander are all spread out. I should take a moment to point this out. Obviously, this lets them claim the most clusters, and therefore the most ground batteries quickly. The other benefit, though, is it can help counter the Remnant corvettes. Even if you can't contest them, by spreading out your strike carriers, you can limit them to single kills at a time, and if you've got, 120, 140 point unit of corvettes that can only kill one strike carrier a turn, it really mitigates their effectiveness. So you can rarely stop your opponent completely from making plays, but if you make them get poor options, just have poor shots, you can slowly work yourself into an advantage. And that's one other reason that strike carriers are all so heavily spread out. So here the launch cruisers advance up the side on standard orders and drop a layer, which is not too surprising. What is surprising is that the TTA did not bring their strike carriers or corvettes onto the field in the first round. This means essentially giving the UCM uncontested control of the middle clusters for a round. However, Miniboss knew he couldn't beat me in a straight atmosphere fight, so this does leave my Santiagos without any targets. They're essentially a dead activation. And he's banking on advancing later with his corvettes and strike carriers being better supported, as potentially being able to catch up without sacrificing them early for no gain. When it's the Santiago's turn to activate, they drop a layer and move up to the middle so they can potentially flex to cover any mid-cluster where they might be needed the following turn, although they still lack targets. During the roundup phase, there isn't much to do. The Triumvir does launch some fighters on the Aldrin in case the Santiagos felt like suiciding into them, but really there's not much happening in this roundup. So round 2. So the big question this round with the column deployment is what groups are going to be coming on. For the TTA, they clearly need to get their corvettes and strike carriers on the board if they have any hope of catching up in the ground game, so that's probably certain to happen. For the UCM, there's a couple options. I opted for bringing the Johannesburg group, which brings the Admiral to get you your starting cards early. It has some fighter coverage, it also has most of the remaining drop, so that's a shoo-in. The other thing I decided to bring in was the Kiev group, because I was really hoping to get a double attack. If the TTA were to move close enough, they could get to do a last first, fire twice activation and do devastating damage. And even if not, they're going to be my largest amount of DPS and the ability to cover the atmosphere, so it seemed like a good bet. First activation is San Fran versus Munifex. Again, we're in a part of the game where neither of us are in a position to get off a first strike, so we're just activating things that are predictable and have safe known moves. That way we aren't giving our opponent additional information before we're forced to. So the San Fran, now being in range, drops a lair and gets positioned to drop. The Lysanders all go into atmosphere. Next up, the Munifex move forward and drop into low orbit near the rest of the main TTA force in range of the middle two clusters. So second activation is Johannesburg versus the Strike Carrier group from the TTA. The Johannesburg leads, and it goes on standard orders, dropping a lair and advancing behind the debris field. The New Orleans also advance, dropping a lair and staying spread out as we've discussed to try to make themselves difficult targets for the Munifex. One thing to note is that Johannesburg, because it has great arcs, is lining itself up so that it can just continue to weapons free in a straight line, and it will pop around the corner of that debris field with the ability to cover essentially all the contested clusters and use all its weapons while staying in cover currently. The TTA then advance their strike carriers just off camera below the screen, sticking to the cover of the Munifex. So the TTA are developing their tanky drop force around the Triumvir, and then the Senecas are coming up on the far end of the screen as a flanking force along with the launch cruisers. Next up, the launch cruisers and the Santiago. So the launch cruisers go first and just advance on standard orders to the debris field ahead of them. They're still not in range of anything, so they're taking it slow. The Santiago still not having any targets in range because the TTA atmospheric ships were late, so they advance just in range of the Munifex. They've got longer range so that they are positioned to attack in low orbit if they activate first, or preferably catch them in atmosphere if they activate later. But in no situation would the Munifex be able to counterattack them first. For next flip, it's the Triumvir and the Kiev groups. So the Triumvir and Aldrin go first and continuing their advance to the in range of the home cluster, dropping another box of scraps protecting both Aldrins at this point. Now, next up we've got the Kiev activation, and we're going to have to take some time here because this is one of the major game decisions. I really wanted to get in a double attack with those Kievs, but Mini-Boss is a savvy commander and all his ships are out of range by at least half an inch, so I can't hit anything this turn. But I could still get off a first activation weapons-free next round. And the Johannesburg will also be in range, and I've got that incoming Rio Seattle, which would be in range after the launch cruisers are forced to be moving up. So in my mind, I can still charge in, alpha strike these launch cruisers, and then round 4 have everyone turn to cross the central cluster after the Triumvir and drop, with the Kiev sticking around to clean up those pesky Seneca. And this isn't an unusual expectation. Most of my games I play, I feel, are positioning around 1 or 2 before a big turn 3 fight. So I do move up the Kiev, and in fact I max thrust them because I didn't want him escaping with a launch chaff or a drop spike card. You know, I'm about to drop the hammer here. There's no time for caution, we just gotta get in there. But consider that unlike every other faction, I actually outrange the resistance. There's no reason I've got to charge in right now. In fact, my original plan was to just wait for them to come up, and it would have been a better option to just bring the Kievs on and try for this whole double tap next round when all my ships are definitively in range and the resistance still couldn't do anything about it. So that probably in retrospect would have been a better idea. But let's take that one step further. Look at the map as a whole, because this is a big deal. The TTA have already committed all their drop, and it is all here on the other side of the map. They have no realistic way of contesting these two clusters. These Seneca and launch cruisers really aren't threatening anything, except perhaps the San Fran, which could still move up and drop the central cluster before they can stop it, essentially completing its mission. So if I just ignored them, left them behind, then these slow, short-range ships would be out of position for at least another turn while I'm fighting the rest of his fleet. And sure, destroying enemies is good, but marginalizing them without even having to spend ammo is even better. So if I've been staying focused on what the real objectives were and taking stock of what his resources left were, there was an opportunity to make a much stronger play here. However, in my defense, I was distracted taking a whole lot of pictures for this, and so admittedly mistakes were made. But you know what? We're going to charge in there and we're going to fight. So that's why the Kievs are going straight up. The Limas then also move up and place spikes on the far launch cruiser. Okay, for the roundup phase, the TTA launched bombers on the Kiev. I'm not sure exactly how many. I wrote down 9. That doesn't make sense. Probably 6 because I think the Triumvir wasn't in range. But at any rate, there's a good amount on the Kiev. Don't worry about it. The Johannesburg dropped 3 fighters in response to defend, and both sides dropped some ground assets. Okay, round 3. So this is where things start kicking off. And here we need to take a second to discuss the activation order because in this case some big decisions are being made. On the TTA side, the mini-boss is really concerned with protecting his dropped assets. He does not want to move up the Aldrin, Unifex, or Strike carriers an inch before he has to, and potentially put them in range. Therefore, he's going to focus on activating all his gunships early, knowing that's potentially going to mean missing out on some shots, but his priority is making sure to defend his drop, which he does not have much of. On the UCM side, I really want to finish off those launch cruisers. So obviously leading off with the Kievs is key, but I also want to make sure my last activation is for the Johannesburg, so that if the cruisers try to wiggle or things change, I have time to set up whatever additional spikes I may need to get that shot off as well. So first activation, and it's the Kievs versus the gun cruisers. The gun cruisers are out of range of everything, so I let them go first, and they just come onto the board under standard orders, drop a layer, they've got nothing to shoot. They're coming up to help the launch cruisers. The Galileo then comes on off camera and puts a spike on the sand frame. Next up, the Kiev and Lima activate, and here I realize I made a miscalculation. The original plan was to weapons free and shoot the launch cruisers while staying out of range of the Seneca. But by boosting so much, my minimum move on weapons free puts me in Seneca range, which could easily destroy the Kievs, and almost nothing else is going to be in range to take them out. So instead I'm forced to have the Limas spike the Seneca and divide fire between 2 of them and the launch cruiser, hoping to take out the immediate threat and do what damage I can. So the Kievs, weapons free, move forward and kill 1 Seneca. The second gets wounded after making 3 out of 4 5F saves, and does 4 damage to the launch cruiser. In return, the bombers are able to break through and knock out 1 Kiev. So the Kievs are left out front spiked, having not really eliminated most of the TTA threats in the area. Overall, not a great position to be in for the destroyers. The next activation is for the Gladiator and Santiagos. The TTA go first, they have a Galileo that's once again coming in off screen and spiking the lead Kiev. The Gladiator is then also sent to reinforce the far flank. Just to again note, as we said before, there are no scoring TTA units over here. This battle on the flank has very little chance of affecting the actual course of the scoring game, which is going to be decided over here. But it is where both sides made contact, and neither is willing to give up on the ships already involved. So we're going to keep pouring reinforcements into this fight that most likely won't end up mattering. The other thing going on here is the Gladiator has to make a choice in how to engage. It can either go in standard orders and drop a layer to get off 1 weapon without any penalty against the Kiev, or it can stay in high orbit and fire weapons free across orbital layers taking a penalty. Now interestingly, with the Galileo token, that's actually not too bad for the Resistance because those 3-up guns will still get a normal 1/3 chance to crit. The big problem with shooting across orbital layers is it takes away a lot of your crit potential. But the Resistance here is actually able to use the Galileo to counter that, and that actually may end up being a good strategy for the Resistance in general. By abusing orbital layers, if they don't suffer as much firing across them as their opponent might, it may be a way for them to get off some cheeky weapons freeze that the enemy has a harder time responding to. At any rate, that's what the Gladiator chooses, to go weapons free while in high orbit, and it is able to successfully destroy a Kiev. Now we get to the Santiago here, and forgive me if I ramble a bit because this was the second big decision that had to come up in the game. If you recall, they were positioned so that they could, if needed to, go first and hit the Munifex in low orbit, so I felt comfortable activating them early if it meant lining up the shots for my cruisers later on. However, when their turn came up, I realized that was a bad idea. In low orbit, they might get 2 Munifex, but they would all surely die from the return fire, which isn't a very good trade. And to stay there meant being hit by single thrust bombers. So, having left myself without good options, despite having the small SR group just to avoid this, I chose to boost them past the potential threats to at least get them going after the undefended Galileo and salvage something from it. But that's why they took a turn to max thrust way past everybody and go after the Galileo. That wasn't the initial plan, but I'd sort of painted myself into a corner there. The next activation are the San Francisco and the launch cruisers. So the San Frans go first, because unknown to most people, the San Fran do actually have guns, and they're not too shabby. So it advances and actually manages to kill off the last Seneca, which sadly only goes up with a blazing wreck. And the Lysanders do their normal 2-inch atmospheric shuffle. My hope here being that I'm going to get a chance to take out the Seneca, drop on one of the other clusters there, and then have a chance to dive for cover and debris before I get counterattacked. Next, the launch cruisers activate, and they drop a layer, advance forward, dropping their entire spike. And then they managed to do only 1 damage to the Kiev. I assume they were a little shaken up by the exploding Senecas next to them. It's completely understandable. And we move on to the next activation, which is going to be the Seattle versus the Munifex. The Seattle will go first, and shockingly, even though the launch cruisers have technically moved up to within range, they drop their spike. So they are now too far for the Seattle or the Rios to reach. So the best we can do is have the Seattle come onto the map, doing active scan to get the first spike that's necessary onto one of the launch cruisers. And then I have the Santiago go and threaten the bottom cluster and drop a layer. If I'd waited a turn to kick all this off, that Seattle probably would have been in range like the Rios to follow it to really give some help. But here we are. It's okay. Things are going forward. On the TTA side, the Munifex activate and, as expected, go forward and destroy the one Lysander in orbit. Although, again, at least by splitting up, I denied them getting more than 1 kill here. For the 5th activation, it's the Strike Carrier and Seneca versus the Rios. So at this point, there are no Seneca, so the Strike Carriers are able to advance unmolested into atmosphere in the bottom cluster. For the Rios, they move forward, doing, again, active scan. Now, one of them has to active scan, so it stays in high orbit. The other drops to low orbit, but unfortunately, neither of them are going to be in range. So they simply come into the map and set things up for the Johannesburg to follow. So they do come with 2 New Orleans, and those are again going to go toward the middle and bottom clusters. And you might ask, well, why are you setting it toward the bottom cluster? Do I really think 2 Santiago and 1 New Orleans are going to beat all the resistance corvettes and strike carriers that are there? And the answer is no, they're not going to be able to defeat them, but they can keep the pressure on. The goal is that if I can continue to threaten that area, it's going to pin those strike carriers and corvettes to that area longer, because if I don't, they're going to pack up and move toward the middle, which they could take, and would be a big difference. So by continuing to slowly trickle in reinforcements, he's either forced to leave one or all of those battle groups there to defend the cluster, or risk that I could take it away from him if he leaves too early. So it's not important that I have to take it, but I got to keep the pressure on, and that's why things are still trickling in over there. And for the final activation of the round, we have both flagships, the Triumvir and Johannesburg. The Triumvir elects to go second, so the Johannesburg, it cost me a lot to have him last instead of, say, those Santiagos are really needed, but this is the thing I was going for, was it is in range and can pull off a weapons free. So it goes weapons free, it advances and gets all its rounds off on the weakened launch cruiser and successfully destroys it, causing a blazing wreck. The New Orleans then advance. One drops into the atmosphere of the middle cluster, the other stays in low orbit, waiting to commit to the middle or bottom cluster, depending on where the Unifex go. For the Triumvir battle group, it does something interesting. Fearing that my Santiagos were going to come around eventually and cause more trouble for the middle clusters, the mini-boss actually had the Triumvir do a course change, pull a hard left, and try to launch some single-thrust bombers at the Santiagos, which I really was not expecting. I didn't even realize he could get it in range that way. And in the meantime, the Aldrins advanced straight forward, hoping to continue on toward the middle cluster. Now we go to the turn 3 roundup phase. Starting with ground battery fire, each of the ground batteries have 2 3-up shots, so in theory they could be a huge force in this game, and part of why I liked the heavy atmosphere first strategy. However, this turn they whiff pretty hard. Ultimately, the Blue CM controlled ground stations target the Gladiator and Aldrin, managing to do a single point of damage to the Gladiator. In return, the TTA ground battery targets and misses a San Fran. The Blue CM lost initiative, and therefore they had to declare bombers first. I sent 3 at the remaining launch cruiser, expecting to tie up some of his launch as defensive fighters, but the TTA then proceeded to place single thrust bombers on the Kiev, as well as the Santiagos off camera. Next came fighter launches. I felt the Kiev had the better chance of surviving, so it got 3 defensive fighters. Being in single thrust, the Kiev and Santiago strikes resolved immediately. Between the Kiev's decent PD, fighters, and 3 up armor, no damage was done to it. 2 Santiagos managed to make it through their bomber wave. The remaining UCM bombers will land next turn. Drop assets are then deployed by both sides, with the resistance playing the local resistance cells card to give themselves some extra infantry in the bottom cluster, which they are now decisively winning. And that brings us to round 4, the first scoring turn. First activation is the San Fran versus the Munifex. Now at this point, the TTA gun cruisers and Gladiator are still at extreme range, making it hard to line up a shot. However, I finally remember that makes it hard for them to shoot the UCM ships as well. So by getting the San Fran into cover first, I can deny them any good targets while focusing on the Aldrin and launch cruiser that are already within range. So here the San Fran does an immediate course change before any of the other cruisers can activate and dives next to the debris field. The Lysander continue their 2-inch atmospheric shuffle, though, again, if I'd been paying attention to the fact that these clusters far from the camera are already secured, I probably should have taken that far Lysander and pulled it out of atmosphere to get it to start moving toward the middle cluster. The Munifex activate first to get in a first strike against the incoming drop, because again, the TTA has to do something about that incoming threat to their bottom cluster. And the way the Naval boss chose to deal with it is, well, if the Munifex can just take out the strike carrier and Santiago's, then his strike carriers will be freed up to go help for the fight in the middle. But they're fighting in low orbit, so they're missing out on their air-to-air bonus, and not all of them are quite in range. So they're only able to destroy 1 Santiago. The corvettes are definitely better when fighting within atmosphere. So the next flip is the gun cruisers versus the Seattle. The Galileo spikes the Johannesburg just to get the damage bonus token placed on it. The gun cruisers advance and destroy the Kiev, able to use all their guns on standard orders, compared to the UCM fleet, which is lit up like a Christmas tree to try to spike them and use all their guns. The Seattle's goal at this point is to keep the launch cruiser lit for the Rios and stay out of the front arc of the Gladiator. That ship can do tremendous damage if allowed to go weapons free. So the Blue CM need to use their arcs to deny any good shots. The Seattle continues on active scan while firing across the orbital layer, doing a fair job getting 2 damage. The remaining Santiago then advances into atmosphere in the bottom cluster to do what damage it can. For the third activation, it's the Santiago versus the Gladiator. The Santiagos advance and kill the Gladiator's Galileo. Again, I'm really scared of that ship. All the UCMs are hiding from it, so the Gladiator really can't reach anything this turn. It drops orbit and spike while in standard orders and trying to line up on the Johannesburg for next turn. Next activation is the Triumvir versus the Limas. The Triumvir now starts the long process of turning around. This is the trouble with inertia in Dropfleet. It can take a while for ships to bring themselves back around if they aren't already on target. It's a big weakness of front narrow ships in the late game. So the Triumvir is starting the process, and it places a box of scraps on itself. The Limas then advance and spike the Aldrin, hoping to line up a weapons-free strike from the Rios. Fifth activation is the Rios versus the launch cruisers. This would have been a strategy rating tie, but the Blue CM play Admiral's directive to lower their strategy rating. Unfortunately, the Rios weren't lined up well like the J-Berg when it was coming on, and the low orbit one would clip debris if it goes straight, while the high orbit would be firing across layers. So instead they go standard orders, missing out on their wing guns. They keep the Gladiator behind cover, gotta deny that weapons free, and destroy the final launch cruiser with their main rail guns. It still hurts they couldn't hit the Aldrin at the same time. The New Orleans also moves forward to the middle cluster. Unfortunately, the launch cruisers do not get their turn. Final activation is the Johannesburg versus the strike carriers. The Johannesburg now demonstrates the true power of turrets by turning slightly to the left while being able to keep the Aldrin in arc and denying shots to the Gladiator, whose captain is rather frustrated by this point. It is still able to cripple the Aldrin, but the ship survives with only a fire. One New Orleans on the bottom cluster advances and tries to contest. The other interestingly rises to low orbit in the center. I was mistakenly thinking that the Aldrin would score critical locations at strategy rating 5 instead of strategy rating 2, and so that therefore they would be tied with the Johannesburg, and I needed that strike cruiser to rise up and win the tie, but that was just an unnecessary mistake in case you're wondering why that one's not dropping this turn. For the TTA side, their strike carriers shuffle forward in the bottom cluster. So now we get to the roundup phase. The TTA wins initiative, and we alternate firing ground batteries. I'm hoping the guns will be able to finish off the wounded Aldrin, however the mini-boss plays a sabotage card to shut down one of the sectors. So of the 4 blue CM batteries, 1 is sabotaged, 1 misses, 1 cannot reach the Aldrin and manages to do 1 damage on a gladiator, and the last manages to destroy the wounded Aldrin, but it's brought back by the box of scraps, keeping it together with 3 hull, and it cannot be crippled again. In response, the 1 TTA battery misses the San Fran. Technically, the ground combat occurred next, but we're going to see that a bit later. Next, we move on to launch, and the Blue CM's last chance to try to get one of those pesky Aldrins. So the Blue CM launched 6 bombers on the wounded Aldrin, but they are out of sync, with half arriving at single thrust and the other half on double thrust. The Triumvir has 6 fighters on the defense. These all block the single thrust bombers. Now this is actually one of the cases where it would have made sense to use escort fighters. Normally this isn't a good idea because 1 bomber hits for slightly more than 1 fighter blocks, so you're better off just bringing extra bombers rather than bringing escort fighters. But if one of your carriers is too far away, this actually becomes a good idea because your double thrust fighters could still support your single thrust bombers in the same activation. It just doesn't come up often, so I didn't actually consider it, but that would have been a good move here. And finally, we get to drop assets. Because the TTA were not positioned to drop on every sector in the bottom cluster, the Blue CM were able to sneak an armor division onto the single uncontested sector, and that meant that they were able to contest the cluster. On the central cluster, the 2 Aldrin were able to place 12 infantry and take the central cluster. This is one of the advantages of bulk landers. Control of a cluster is determined by who controls the most individual sectors, defined as having the most tokens on them. Armor tokens are more effective at combat than infantry, and have over time, 3 strike carriers will on average win against a similarly costed troopship, but that's over time. Immediately after dropping 12 tokens, the troopships can take control of a cluster simply by outnumbering. Whether they will have the numbers to hold it till turn 6 is a slightly different question though. So the Blue CM clearly control the 2 clusters on the left. On the right, they have control of 1 sector, which means they get points for contesting that cluster. In the middle, they don't control any of the sectors. Even though they are fighting for it, they don't have any individual sector where they have the majority of tokens. So there's no points for the UCM on the middle cluster ground game. Now, in orbit over the middle cluster, the UCM have the Johannesburg and the 1 unnecessary New Orleans, giving them a tonnage of 11 compared to the tonnage of 4 for the 2 Aldrins of the TTA, giving them the critical point over the middle cluster. All this is worth 10 points for the UCM. In comparison, the TTA have full control on the ground of 3 different clusters, as well as having orbital control over the critical point on the right cluster from a single strike carrier, giving them the lead with a total of 12 points. So the big question running through this round is going to be, can the UCM stop the TTA from getting off another turn of drop from the 2 bulk landers? So first flip is going to be the Seattle versus the gun cruisers for the TTA. Seattle is first, so it moves up, targets, and was able to successfully kill the wounded Aldrin, with its explosion doing 1 damage to its neighbor. The Santiago, hiding just below the screen, whiffs at its 1 shot at the strike carriers. For the TTA battle group, the Galileo starts by spiking the Seattle, then the gun cruisers advance, but I launched chaff, so they were no longer in range of the Seattle, and were forced to settle for killing the San Fran. So next up we have the Gladiator and the former Kiev battle group, just Limas now. The Gladiator finally gets back in the game, targeting the Seattle, but because it had to go around the debris field on standard orders, it only gets 2d3 shots, ending up doing a total of 4 damage. For the Lima activation, I spiked the Gladiator. The reason I needed it lit up is that yes, the Aldrins are the big key this turn, but if I don't stop the Gladiator, it will likely kill the Johannesburg and help the mini-boss threaten claiming all 3 critical points. So I do really need to stop both, which means splitting fire and counting on at least some of the dice to go my way. The third activation is the Johannesburg and Triumvir. The Johannesburg leads off by doing a weapons-free drive-by. It's putting all its guns in the Aldrin except for the left wing turret, which has to shoot the Gladiator. The Aldrin ends up crippled, but suffers a life-saving sensors offline, meaning no additional damage done. So it's hanging in there with the box of scraps still in reserve. The Gladiator takes no damage from the pot shot. The Triumvir finally completes turning around and comes toward the center. That really took a while. The Aldrin, having nowhere else to hide, boldly stays in the point, ready to try to get off one more drop if it can. And finally, the New Orleans remember to move. The day may come when I remember all the strike carrier activations during their actual activation, but it was not this day. For the next flip, we have the Munifex versus the Rios. The Rios here get to show off why UCM firepower is so efficient. They target their wind cannons on the Aldrin, whose armor is now cracked, remember, while being able to devote all their main guns to the Gladiator. The Aldrin is destroyed, but resurrects due to the box of scraps. The Gladiator is crippled, but once again the sensors take the hit and no additional damage is done. New Orleans in the middle gets to scoot up slightly, and now it's time for the Munifex. The Munifex are desperately needed in the middle, but they can't turn quite enough to avoid the debris field, meaning for now they're going to have to move just up to it. And now we're to the fifth activation, where we're getting down to the forgotten ships of the game, the Santiagos and strike carriers. For the strike carriers part, they shuffle in the bottom cluster and take some pot shots at the Corvette harassing them. They could make a run for center at this point, but they likely would not survive that extra turn going up into low orbit before they could go back down to atmosphere and drop. And at least where they are now, they're in position to claim a critical location for the mini-boss. The Santiagos course change and start coming back onto the map, but you can really see how late game it is hard to bring all your ships where they need to be. And the Corvettes on both sides and the Triumvir are having real trouble coming around. So sometimes you have to remember that if your enemy is way off in a corner, you really have to consider the time cost it takes to go after them and reach him there. The final activation is a lonely UCM Lysander that rises to low orbit and finally turns back toward the central cluster. If I'd remembered that a turn or two earlier, that would have helped, but you do what you can. So now we're down to the roundup phase. Here, we forgot if you fought ground combat before or after firing from the sectors. The actual order, for the record, is to fire from sectors and stations, then move ground assets, followed by ground asset combat. But here we rolled off and ended up doing fight first, then shoot. So in the bottom right, the TTA lost 3 infantry for 1 tank, and in the top left sector, they lost 2 infantry for no loss on the UCM side. As you can see, the armored divisions are definitely better in a straight fight. As far as the ground batteries go, the UCM had only one that could reach the unspiked Aldrin that was right underneath it. The other 2 managed to deal 1 damage to the Gladiator. The TTA had 2 batteries that managed to miss the Johannesburg and Seattle. Again, the rolling on the ground batteries was pretty lackluster this game. It could have been a lot more decisive than it was. That brings us to the launch phase. This is it. With the Munifex arriving next turn, control of the middle cluster depends on this last Aldrin, whether or not it's going to get off this additional 2 bulk landers. The railguns and ground batteries have failed to finish it off despite the effort of every force in the UCM trying, and this is the last Blue CM chance to bring it down. So we have 6 single thrust bombers versus 6 resistance fighters. The result is 2 armor saves, which the crippled and armor cracked Aldrin fails. With that, the additional armored divisions are dropped by both sides' strike carriers, and the Gladiator plays emergency repairs to get an additional 2 hull back. Yes, the Remnant is getting a lot of extra hull points back this game. It's a thing they do. Alright, and we're on to the final round. At this point, the ground game is pretty much set, but the score is still tight, and the critical locations are mostly up for grabs. So I wanted to highlight some of the activation minigames that are being played here. Miniboss has 2 major options. He can first activate the Gladiator, basically guaranteeing that he gets off that long denied weapons free, or he can activate the Munifex, which would be able to get into atmosphere before any UCM can cut off the drop. For myself, it was a bit of a guessing game, because if he activates the Gladiator, then the Seattle would be the best bet, as it would get a chance to shoot before it could be destroyed. But if he's activating the Munifex, which I can't interfere with no matter what, then the Johannesburg would be better because it might actually be able to kill the Gladiator before it could fire. So again, it's a bit of an activation guessing game, and this is something that's going on constantly in Dropfleet. So the first flip comes and it's the Munifex versus the Seattle. The mini-boss has been very consistent about focusing on the ground game. So the Munifex activate first, diving into the atmosphere, and manage to kill 2 New Orleans. The Seattle then moves forward onto the critical location and manages to do 3 damage to the Gladiator. It can't kill it in one round, but it sure tries, and it's a lot easier once Remnant armor gets cracked. Second activation is the gun cruisers versus the Johannesburg. I presume Mini-Boss thought the Gladiator would already be destroyed by this point, so he advances forward and fires on the Johannesburg, rolling exactly average to get 5 damage. Now you may note that he advanced off the critical location to do that. I believe he'd forgotten that only the middles were critical, but you know, it's a friendly game, and spoiler alert, it doesn't actually matter. So they go forward and they do some damage to the Johannesburg. In response, the Johannesburg goes weapons free right up to Gladiator, and is able to successfully destroy it with some guns to spare. You'll note in this, it fires and then moves. You can't actually do that. We just didn't move it until after the firing round because there's a bit of a traffic jam that close, but it did move then fire. So third activation is the Limas versus the Late Gladiator. Now round 6 is the time of the Limas. They no longer need to scan, so they can break formation to go attack things. And I have actually had them kill things before with their forgotten one gun, but not this game. They go up and manage to miss the gun cruisers. Fourth activation is the Rios versus the Triumvir. At this point, there really isn't much anyone can do besides advance toward the critical locations. So the Rios do weapons free, managing to do 6 damage, which the tanky Triumvir shrugs off, and the Triumvir then advances onto the point. The next activation is the Santiagos versus the Strike Cruisers. The Santiagos finally make it back from their long odyssey, drop into atmosphere, and manage to destroy 1 Munifex to pad their stats. The TTA Strike Cruisers shuffle around in orbit, with 1 rising again to claim the critical location. They do try to shoot at the neighboring Santiago with no effect. For the final move of the game, the Lysander makes it back to the center cluster in time to lend its support for the ground game. And with that, it's time to move on to the roundup. For ground movement, the TTA moved all infantry to the top left sector, where then in combat they lost 2 more infantry to no effect. Next we fired the ground batteries. UCM managed to miss the Triumvir. The TTA did manage to do 1 damage, which is enough to cripple the Seattle. Finally, in the launch phase, the Remnant tried to finish off the Seattle with a mass bomber attack, but 6 on 6, the TTA couldn't break through, and the cruiser remained. And to finish out, the final armor divisions are dropped, and it's time to go to score. With that final drop, the UCM were able to complete control of the middle cluster. So at this point, the UCM have the middle critical location with 15 tonnage to 10. They also have the left 3 clusters for an additional 12 total points. The TTA have the right 2 clusters and 1 critical location for 8 points. Final score is 20-22, which in our book is a draw. Alright, now for the after action report, because let's talk about this battle. It was very fun, very close, and also very weird. Here we've got the kill points, and I have to say that this is the most unfought game I have ever played, with both sides ending up with most of their ships still alive at the end. I blame this a lot on the early losses of DPS ships, the tough durability of the TTA, and Mini-Boss's focus on activating his ground game over getting in additional shots. Or perhaps, both sides just lack that killer instinct when they're fighting against their allies. Who knows, but this was a very low kill game. Most of the time, I feel like at least one side is almost wiped out when it comes to Dropfleet and the tendency of crits to make all ships explode. So from the TTA perspective, did their strategy work? Recall, the Mini-Boss's original plan was to have the slow, tanky drop division soaking up the fire, while the more glass cannon flanking force of gun cruisers, gladiator, and launch cruisers come up the side and actually deal the damage. Well, amongst the things that did, the Triumvir certainly did provide a huge amount of durability. In addition to the 5 hull it directly restored, there was a bunch of overkill from having to kill the Aldrin 4 times, so probably a total of 10 damage saved. And there was also a strike cruiser in the bottom cluster that had a box of scraps preventing the Santiago from targeting and killing it. So as far as being a bullet sink, that part of the plan was definitely effective. Amongst the damage dealers of the TTA, it was a bit more mixed. The gun cruisers did do solid damage, and the slipperiness of them and the launch cruisers did allow them to avoid some fire. But this flanking glass cannon force did end up being quite slow. The Gladiator never quite got to unleash its full force, and the gun cruisers took a long time to get into the fight with their late deployment and low speeds. With the benefit of hindsight, it may have been better to do some more aggressive initial max thrust to get the gun cruisers up into battle sooner, and to come in from multiple angles instead of along a single axis. That would have made it harder for the UCM to hide behind the cover. Drop was another big weakness. Without enough drop, there really wasn't a way for the Remnant to contest 2 out of the 5 clusters, which meant Mini-Boss was fighting hard to get that draw, and a solid victory was pretty much off the table. Splitting off some of the strike carriers into a separate group, or even just including a single bulk lander on all those cruisers, may have provided a lot more flexibility. As it was, I would say the lack of drop gave the UCM a pretty big build advantage here, but it was the Mini-Boss's ability to capitalize on UCM mistakes and his consistent focus on protecting his own drop over damage that allowed the Remnant to nearly pull off a win. For MVP to the Remnant, I believe it is definitely the Triumvir. It kept the limited TTA drop in it till very nearly the end of the game, along with their Admiral. It did some good damage to the Kiev and Santiagos, kept up fighter coverage, and looked dang good doing it. All around, a big improvement from its pre-buff form, which would not have actually used its special role this game. Definitely think this makes a good Admiral home in midpoint battles, and fits with Resistance theme of being scrappy and durable. Just don't question how it puts a frigate back together after being hit with an overcharged hypernova laser. Way to go, Triumvir! So what about the Blue CM side? Well, you know my strategy from the beginning was to grab the atmosphere and bait in the short-range Remnant. So how did that go? Well, it's hard to say because it wasn't really tried. Because I rushed in with the Kievs and mistimed the Santiagos, I missed out on all that anti-atmosphere strike that was the base of the plan. I think it potentially would have worked really well if I'd been more patient, but who knows? That said, if I were going to try again, I feel like the need for so many light ships made it tough. Both the Santiagos and the Kiev wanted that last activation, and it was hard to get in enough strike carriers. Perhaps in the future, instead of this strike group of 3 Kiev and Limas, I would just take a Kiev pair in a line group, which may be better if I'm only using them for anti-atmosphere. After all, in-atmosphere carriers don't dodge. And that would have allowed more Corvettes and strike carriers to take that Pathfinder slot. Among things that went well, though, I think my ability to threaten and maintain pressure on all the midline clusters worked out pretty well. Even though I lost the bottom cluster, I was able to tie up most of his drop there until it was way too late for them to relocate. Also, the plan for launch generally worked out. Though they had twice my launch assets, the Remnant really weren't able to get any decisive damage through the fighter coverage, which meant that my greater number of guns and the ability to use cover against his Gladiator meant I was slowly winning the game in orbit. And this is the most common way I find the UCM winning their carrier battles, with railguns. So for me, the lessons going forward, number 1, pay attention to the scoring game early and often. Usually I spend turn 1 to 3 trying to implement the plan. And then after our words, I go around looking at the end of turn 3, starting to figure out, well, what's my pathway to win? What clusters and critical locations are available? What this game shows is that I really need to start making that check far earlier and more often, keeping eyes on my enemy's drop, and watching for when it has all been committed. Because if I was paying attention, I could have known much earlier where the key points are and been repositioning and using my drop far more effectively. The other lesson I would say is to not be rushed. I felt a lot of pressure to move up and attack as soon as the range was technically feasible, even though I was still safe where I was, and it was a bit of a stretch, for which the mini-boss did punish me. So again, when you know you're out of range and you have a plan, stay calm and carry on. For the UCM MVP, I have to go with the Seattle. Technically the Johannesburg did more, but it's the flagship and the most expensive unit. Sometimes the little guys deserve to be highlighted. The Seattle managed to active scan twice to keep the launch carriers lit up, assisted or confirmed kills on the launch cruiser, Gladiator, and Aldrin with its guns, and got the final Aldrin with its launch, all while maintaining the fleet fighter coverage. On paper, this is a ship that shouldn't be any good. It isn't that cheap, it isn't particularly durable, it doesn't have that much launch for a fleet carrier, but its arcs are so flexible and its armor and guns are just good enough that you can send it to do pretty much everything. And it will, pretty much every turn, be doing things. often ending games circle beating ships with launched guns and even close action when they can't even turn to shoot it anymore. So hats off to you, Seattle. Keep flying your little heart out. And that is about all the comments I have to add for now. I hope you found this useful, or at least a little fun. I'm going to let the rest of the extro roll, so take care, Godspeed, and try to finish that fleet.